Professor Klaxon strutted into the lecture hall with all the confidence of someone who had never been wrong about anything in his entire life. Which, considering he was a Zentorian with 4 arms and an ego the size of a small moon, was saying something. His chitinous exoskeleton gleamed under the artificial lighting as he arranged his notes with unnecessary flourish. "Good morning, my intellectually curious students," Klaxon announced, his voice carrying that particular brand of condescension that only tenured professors could perfect. "Today we continue our study of advanced predator dynamics across the galaxy." The classroom was a diverse collection of alien life forms, each trying their best to look interested while secretly wondering if they could transfer to galactic literature instead. Zephyr, a crystalline being whose body literally chimed when she moved, sat in the front row taking meticulous notes. Behind her, Gloop bobbed gently in his specialized chair, his gelatinous form occasionally shifting colors to express emotions that his species had never bothered to name. In the back corner, Spike clicked his mandibles rhythmically, a nervous habit that had driven 3 previous roommates to request transfers. "Now then," Klaxon continued, activating the holographic display with 2 of his arms while the other 2 gestured dramatically. "Let us examine the hunting patterns of the Regillian shadowcat, a masterpiece of solitary predation." The hologram showed a sleek, 6-legged creature stalking through purple vegetation. Klaxon was just warming up to his favorite topic when the door to the lecture hall hissed open. In walked a human. The entire class turned to stare, which was no small feat considering that some of them didn't technically have heads that could turn. The human looked remarkably ordinary by human standards. Medium height, brown hair, carrying what appeared to be a worn leather bag. He wore the standard Galactic University uniform, but somehow managed to make it look like he had just rolled out of bed. "Ah," Klaxon said, his voice dripping with the kind of false patience that suggested he was about to make someone's day significantly worse. "Mr. Morrison, how delightful of you to join us. Please, take a seat so we can continue learning about real predators." Jake Morrison glanced around the room, nodded politely to a few students, and slid into an empty seat near the middle. He pulled out a tablet and stylus, apparently unfazed by the attention or the professor's obvious irritation. "As I was saying," Klaxon resumed, "the shadowcat represents the pinnacle of predatory evolution. Solitary, efficient, ruthless. Unlike the primitive creatures found on certain backwater worlds." He shot a meaningful look at Jake. "Some planets, you see, never quite figured out how to produce proper predators. They're stuck with adorable little mammals that probably couldn't hunt their way out of a protein synthesis chamber." Several students chuckled. Zephyr chimed softly, which was her species' equivalent of polite laughter. Gloop shifted to a pleased shade of amber. Jake continued taking notes, seemingly oblivious to the fact that he had just become the target of academic condescension. He occasionally glanced up at the holographic display, then back to his tablet, his expression completely neutral. "Take Earth, for example," Klaxon continued, warming to his theme. "A little blue marble in an unremarkable star system. The dominant predators there are things like wolves and lions, creatures so unsophisticated they still hunt in groups. Imagine that, having to gang up on your prey because you're not skilled enough to handle it alone." More chuckles from the class. Even Spike's mandible clicking took on an amused rhythm. That's when Jake looked up from his tablet and spoke for the first time. "Actually, Professor," he said quietly, "you might want to be careful about making assumptions." The lecture hall went quiet. Not the good kind of quiet where everyone's deeply engaged with the material, but the uncomfortable kind where someone had just said something that made everyone's stomachs drop. Well, for those species that had stomachs. Professor Klaxon's 4 arms froze mid-gesture, his compound eyes fixed on Jake with the kind of stare usually reserved for students who had the audacity to point out errors in published research. "Excuse me, Mr. Morrison." Jake set down his stylus and leaned back in his chair. "I'm just saying, maybe you should know a little more about a planet's ecosystem before you dismiss it as primitive. Earth might be different from what you're expecting." Klaxon's exoskeleton actually made a small, creaking sound as he drew himself up to his full height. "Oh, by all means, please enlighten us. I'm sure your charming little world has produced some truly fearsome bunny rabbits." The class erupted in laughter. Zephyr's chiming reached a pitch that was almost musical. Gloop turned a delighted shade of pink and jiggled with amusement. Even Spike's mandibles clicked in what passed for mirth among his people. "Or perhaps," Klaxon continued, clearly enjoying himself now, "you'd like to tell us about your planet's apex predator? Let me guess, some sort of large cat that has to sneak up on grazing animals because it lacks the skill for a proper confrontation." More laughter. Someone in the back row made what sounded like a meowing noise, which sent several students into fresh fits of giggles. Jake waited patiently for the laughter to die down. When it did, he looked directly at Professor Claxon and said, "Sure, I'd be happy to explain why no predator on Earth hunts alone." "Oh, this should be precious," Claxon said, settling into his chair with all 4 arms crossed. "Please, regale us with tales of your cooperative bunny rabbits." "Actually," Jake said, pulling up something on his tablet, "let me ask you a question first, Professor. What do you think happens to a predator species that can't adapt to hunt cooperatively on a world where everything else is trying to kill it?" Claxton waved a dismissive hand. "They evolve better hunting techniques, obviously. Sharper claws, better camouflage, enhanced speed, basic evolutionary pressure." "Right," Jake nodded. "And what if those don't work? Then they find a different ecological niche, or they go extinct. This is elementary xenobiology, Mr. Morrison." Jake smiled. It wasn't a particularly warm smile. "Exactly, they go extinct." The laughter had stopped now. Something in Jake's tone suggested that story time was about to take a very different turn than anyone expected. "So, Professor," Jake continued, "what do you think it means when I tell you that on Earth, there are no solitary predators left?" The silence stretched uncomfortably. Claxon's compound eyes narrowed as he processed this information. That's simply not possible. Evolution doesn't work that way. There are always ecological niches for solitary hunters." "You're right," Jake agreed. "There should be. But let me tell you about wolves." He tapped his tablet, and suddenly the holographic display showed a pack of gray wolves moving through snow-covered forest. Canis lupus, your basic Earth predator. Now, you're probably thinking these look pretty standard, right? 4 legs, fur, teeth, nothing too impressive. Loop had shifted to a more neutral, beige color. Zephyr's chiming had stopped entirely. Even Spike's mandible clicking had slowed to an uncertain rhythm. "Here's what makes them interesting," Jake continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone explaining something very simple to very slow children. "They hunt in coordinated packs of 4 to 10 individuals. But it's not just mob tactics. Watch this." The hologram showed the wolves spreading out in a complex formation around a herd of elk. "See? They're not just chasing prey. They're using tactical coordination. Those 2 on the left, they're driving the herd toward an ambush point. The one on the right is cutting off escape routes. And the alpha pair? They're selecting the target based on age, health, and separation from the group." Professor Claxon leaned forward despite himself. "That's unusually sophisticated for pack behavior." "Oh, we're just getting started," Jake said cheerfully. "Let me show you lions." The display shifted to the African savanna. A pride of lions lounged in the shade, looking deceptively lazy. "Panthera leo. Now here's where it gets fun. The females do most of the hunting, and they've got it down to a science. They use terrain, wind direction, and coordinated timing to execute complex ambush strategies." The hologram showed lionesses spreading out in a semicircle, communicating through subtle body language and positioning. They can adjust their strategy on the fly based on prey behavior. And the males? Their job isn't just to look pretty. They're the heavy assault unit for when things go wrong, and they defend territory from other predator packs. Zephyr finally spoke up, her voice creating a small, nervous chime. "But surely these are exceptional cases. Pack hunting must be rare." Jake's smile got a little wider. "Would you like to hear about hyenas?" "Hyenas?" Spike clicked uncertainly. "Aren't those scavengers?" "Common misconception," Jake said, pulling up footage of spotted hyenas. Crocuta actually hunts more than it scavenges. They live in clans that can number up to 100 individuals, with complex social hierarchies based on intelligence and cooperation. They use coordinated relay hunting to run down prey over distances that would kill a solitary predator. The hologram showed hyenas working in seamless coordination, some running the prey while others rested, then switching off in a pattern that could continue for hours. "Their social structure is so advanced that they have what we call democratic decision-making," Jake continued. "When the clan needs to choose between hunting targets, they literally vote through a process of group vocalization and movement patterns." Professor Claxon was no longer lounging in his chair. All 4 of his arms were gripping the armrests. This level of coordination suggests intelligence levels that..." "That what, Professor?" Jake asked mildly. "That seem unusually high for primitive predators from a backwater world." The class was dead silent now. Even the usual background hum of the environmental systems seemed muted. Gloop had turned an alarmed shade of pale yellow. "But here's the thing that should really interest you as xenobiologists," Jake said, his tone still conversational. These aren't special cases. This is just how predators work on Earth. Because the ones that didn't learn to cooperate? He paused for effect. Well, Professor Claxon already told you what happens to species that can't adapt. Claxon's voice came out smaller than before. They go extinct. Exactly, Jake nodded. They go extinct. Jake leaned back in his chair and cracked his knuckles, a sound that made several aliens visibly flinch. But you know what? I've been going easy on you. Those were just the obvious ones. Let me tell you about the predators you really wouldn't expect. He tapped his tablet again. The hologram shifted to show what looked like a peaceful ocean scene. Dolphins leaped playfully through the waves, their sleek bodies glistening in the sunlight. Tursiops truncatus, Jake announced. Bottlenose dolphins. Look at them. Cute, right? Friendly? The kind of creature that would make you think, "Ah, what adorable ocean puppies." Zephyr chimed nervously. They do appear quite harmless. Right up until you realize they're one of the most sophisticated pack hunters on the planet, Jake said, his voice taking on that same cheerful, educational tone that was starting to make everyone deeply uncomfortable. Dolphin pods don't just hunt together, they strategize. They use echolocation to coordinate attacks on schools of fish, with some dolphins herding while others strike from specific angles. The hologram zoomed in to show dolphins working in perfect synchronization, creating mud rings to trap fish, then taking turns to feed while others maintained the formation. But here's where it gets really interesting, Jake continued. They use tools. They pick up sponges to protect their noses while hunting in rough terrain. They create nets out of water and mud, and they teach these techniques to their young through what can only be described as formal education. Professor Claxon's voice was strained. Tool use? Formal education? These are indicators of sapient-level intelligence. Oh, you think that's impressive? Jake's grin was becoming genuinely unsettling. Let me show you their cousins. The scene shifted to show massive black and white forms cutting through Arctic waters. Orcas, their distinctive markings making them look like living torpedoes designed by someone with a very dark sense of humor. Orcinus orca, Jake said. Killer whales, and before you ask, yes, they absolutely live up to the name. These pods don't just hunt, they conduct military-style operations. They beach themselves deliberately to catch seals, coordinate attacks on whales 10 times their size, and pass down hunting techniques through what we can only call cultural traditions. The hologram showed orcas working together to create waves that would wash seals off ice floes, then catching them with precision that would make a special forces unit proud. Each pod has its own language, Professor, distinct dialects that are passed down through generations. They have family units that stay together for life, and they teach their young not just how to hunt, but when to hunt, what to hunt, and how to adapt their techniques based on local conditions. Spike's mandible clicking had become rapid and agitated. This suggests intelligence levels comparable to you, Jake suggested helpfully. Yeah, that's what we thought too, but wait. There's more. The hologram shifted again, this time to show dense jungle canopy. Dark shapes moved through the trees with fluid grace. Pantroglodytes, Jake announced. Chimpanzees, our closest relatives. And here's where things get really fun, because chimps don't just hunt in packs, they wage war. The silence in the classroom was now so complete you could have heard a pin drop, if anyone had been brave enough to drop one. Organized warfare, Professor Claxon. Territorial disputes that last for years, strategic raids on neighboring groups. They make weapons, they plan attacks, and they execute complex military campaigns that would make your average galactic tactician proud. We've documented cases where chimp armies have systematically eliminated entire rival communities through coordinated strikes over multiple seasons. Gloop had turned a sickly green color and was wobbling uncertainly in his chair. And speaking of weapons, Jake continued, seemingly oblivious to the growing horror in the room. They don't just use tools, they manufacture them. Sharpened sticks for hunting smaller primates, stones selected and modified for specific tasks. They even have what we call cultural inheritance, where different groups develop distinct tool-making traditions. The hologram showed chimpanzees fashioning spears, testing them for balance and sharpness, then working in coordinated groups to hunt other primates with methodical precision. But here's my personal favorite part, Jake said, his voice dropping to an almost conspiratorial whisper. They hold grudges. Individual chimps will remember conflicts for decades and plan revenge attacks with patience that would impress a Centaurian chess master. Professor Claxon tried to speak, failed, cleared his throat with all 4 lungs, and tried again. Mr. Morrison, these behavioral patterns you're describing, They're not just sophisticated pack hunting, they're indicators of full sapient intelligence. Funny you should mention that, Jake said, pulling up a new image. This one showed massive gray forms moving across an African plain. Because let me tell you about elephants. Elephants? Zephyr's voice was barely a whisper now. But aren't those herbivores? Jake's smile was becoming positively predatory. You'd think so, wouldn't you? Loxodonta africana. Peaceful giants, right? Except they have matriarchal societies with complex hierarchies. They pass down knowledge through oral traditions that span generations, and they conduct coordinated military operations that put most galactic armies to shame. The hologram showed elephant herds moving in defensive formations, with scouts, flankers, and reserve units positioned with tactical precision. Remember the locations of water sources across continental distances, they maintain detailed social networks across multiple herds, and they've been observed conducting what can only be described as funeral rites for their dead. But here's the kicker. They actively coordinate with other herds to defend territory and resources. We're talking about strategic alliances between groups that cover thousands of square kilometers. Wait, Spike clicked frantically. Did you say they hold funerals? Oh yes, Jake nodded. They mourn their dead, revisit grave sites, and pass down stories about deceased herd members through vocalizations that we're only beginning to understand. But that's not the scary part. He leaned forward and his voice took on the tone of someone sharing a particularly delicious secret. The scary part is that these peaceful herbivores have been known to conduct coordinated night raids on human settlements when their territory is threatened. Surgical strikes, Professor, planned attacks that target specific infrastructure while avoiding civilian casualties. They're not just intelligent, they're strategic thinkers with a concept of proportional response. The classroom was now so quiet that the environmental systems seemed to be holding their breath. Every alien in the room was staring at Jake with expressions that ranged from horror to fascination to the kind of existential dread usually reserved for students who suddenly realized they'd been attending the wrong class for an entire semester. Professor Claxton's voice came out as barely more than a whisper. Mr. Morrison, are you telling us that your planet is populated entirely by species with near-sapient intelligence levels? Jake considered this question for a moment, then shrugged. Well, I haven't even gotten to the humans yet. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Professor Claxton's exoskeleton had developed a visible tremor, and his forearms were now gripping his chair so tightly that small stress fractures were appearing in the armrests. Before we get to humans, though, Jake said, apparently enjoying himself now, let me explain something that I think you're all missing. See, you keep calling these exceptional cases, or acting surprised that Earth creatures are intelligent, but you're looking at this backwards. He stood up and walked to the front of the classroom, moving with the casual confidence of someone who had just realized he held all the cards in a game everyone else was still trying to understand. Earth isn't a planet that happened to evolve some smart predators, Jake said, his voice carrying clearly through the dead silence. Earth is a planet so fundamentally hostile that intelligence became a basic survival requirement. Everything I've shown you, the pack coordination, the strategic thinking, the long-term planning, that's not exceptional. That's the minimum entry fee for staying alive. He gestured to the holographic display, which now showed a montage of Earth's environments. Dense jungles, frozen tundras, scorching deserts, storm-lashed oceans. You want to know why no predator hunts alone on Earth? Because the planet itself is trying to kill everything on it. We've got weather systems that can level forests, geological activity that reshapes continents, and an atmosphere that's been through more extinction-level events than most species see in their entire evolutionary history. Zephyr's voice came out as a barely audible chime. How many extinction events? 5 major ones that we know of, Jake said casually, plus dozens of smaller ones. Ice ages, asteroid impacts, volcanic eruptions that blocked out the sun for years, changes in atmospheric composition that suffocated 90% of all life. And that's just the natural disasters. Gloop had turned a color that didn't appear anywhere on the normal emotional spectrum for his species. It was sort of a gray-green that suggested he was reconsidering every life choice that had led him to this moment. But here's the really fun part, Jake continued. Even our solitary predators aren't actually solitary. Take bears, for example. The hologram showed a massive grizzly bear, easily twice the size of anything the aliens had expected. Ursus arctos, grizzly bear. Now, your textbooks probably list these as solitary hunters, right? And they are, mostly. But when they need to be, they cooperate. We've documented cases of bears working together to take down large prey, sharing fishing spots during salmon runs, and even coordinating to defend territory from other predators. But they're supposed to be territorial, Spike protested weakly. Me either, Jake agreed. Right up until cooperation becomes more advantageous than competition. See, that's what you're not getting. Earth didn't just produce intelligent predators. It produced adaptable predators, species that can switch between different survival strategies based on environmental pressures. He pulled up another image, this one showing a pride of lions sharing a kill with a pack of hyenas. Competition and cooperation aren't opposites on Earth, they're tools. Our predators use whichever one works best for the situation. Lions and hyenas normally compete, but we've observed them working together when facing threats from leopards or wild dogs. Temporary alliances based on strategic necessity. Professor Claxon's voice came out as a strangled whisper. Strategic necessity? Oh, absolutely, Jake nodded. Because here's what happens to species that can't think strategically on Earth. They don't just go extinct from predation. They go extinct from climate change, habitat loss, disease, natural disasters, or any of the 1,000 other things that can kill you on a death world. Death world? Gloop's voice was barely audible. Jake paused, as if he'd just realized he'd said something significant. Oh, right, I should probably explain that term. A death world is what xenobiologists call a planet where the environmental pressures are so extreme that they force rapid evolution toward intelligence and cooperation. Most inhabited worlds in the galaxy are garden worlds or standard terrestrial types. Earth is what happens when a planet tries really, really hard to kill everything living on it for 4 billion years straight. The silence stretched so long that the environmental systems actually did shut down for their scheduled maintenance cycle, leaving the room in perfect quiet. The thing is, Jake continued, most species would have gone extinct on Earth within a few million years. The only ones that survived were the ones that got really, really good at working together and thinking their way out of problems. So when I tell you that wolves hunt in coordinated packs, or that dolphins have military-style tactics, or that elephants conduct strategic operations, I'm not describing exceptional behavior. I'm describing Tuesday. He walked back to his seat but remained standing. And humans? Jake's smile was now genuinely terrifying. Humans are the species that looked at this nightmare planet full of intelligent cooperative super-predators and said, you know what? We can work with this. Work with it? Zephyr's chiming was so faint it was almost inaudible. We didn't just adapt to Earth, Jake said, his voice dropping to that same conspiratorial whisper. We figured out how to make Earth's other survivors work for us. We took wolves, the apex pack hunters, and convinced them to hunt with us instead of against us. We call them dogs now. The hologram showed humans and dogs working together, hunting, guarding, tracking. We took horses, 1,000-pound prey animals with enough speed and strength to kill a human with one kick, and convinced them to carry us into battle. We took cats, solitary ambush predators, and convinced them to live in our homes and hunt our pests. We even figured out how to make some of our food animals happy about being food animals. Dots. Professor Claxon's voice failed him entirely. Impossible? Jake suggested. Yeah, most of the galaxy thinks so. But here's the thing about humans. We're persistence hunters. We don't run faster than our prey. We don't have bigger claws or sharper teeth. What we do is we keep going. For hours, for days, for generations if necessary. We used to hunt megafauna by literally chasing them until they died of exhaustion. We'd take turns, work in shifts, coordinate over distances that would challenge modern communications equipment. And we did this as a matter of course, because on Earth, if you can't think your way to victory, you die. Jake finally sat down, but his words continued to hang in the air like a toxic cloud. So when you ask me why no predator hunts alone on Earth, Professor, the answer is simple. Because the ones that tried to hunt alone died out millions of years ago. What you're left with is a planet full of intelligent, adaptable, cooperative survivors who have spent their entire evolutionary history learning how to work together to kill things that are bigger, stronger, and more dangerous than they are. He looked around the classroom at the sea of horrified alien faces. And humans are the species that got so good at it that we convinced all the other survivors to join our pack. The silence that followed was so complete that Jake could hear the individual breathing patterns of every species in the room. Zephyr's crystalline structure was vibrating at frequencies that suggested she was on the verge of shattering from stress. Gloop had turned a color that wasn't so much gray as it was the absence of all hope. Spike's mandibles had stopped clicking entirely, frozen in what appeared to be an expression of existential terror. Professor Claxon, meanwhile, was staring at Jake with the look of someone who had just realized that everything he thought he knew about the universe was not just wrong, but catastrophically, dangerously wrong. Finally, Claxon found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Mr. Morrison, if what you're saying is true, then humans aren't just another species. You're describing apex predators with intelligence levels that rival any known sapient race. Jake tilted his head thoughtfully. Well, we prefer to think of ourselves as collaborative problem solvers. Collaborative problem solvers? Spike's voice cracked on the last word. Sure, Jake said with that same casual tone that had been systematically destroying everyone's worldview for the past 20 minutes. What makes you think humans are so special compared to all the other species I've described? Professor Claxon's forearms gestured frantically at the holographic display, which was still showing images of Earth's various nightmare creatures. You've just described a planet populated entirely by super-intelligent apex predators who have spent millions of years perfecting the art of cooperative hunting and strategic warfare. Right, Jake nodded. So what makes humans different? The question hung in the air like a toxic gas. Every alien in the room was clearly thinking the same thing, but none of them wanted to voice it. What could possibly make humans worse than everything they'd already heard? Claxon's voice came out strangled. I'm afraid to ask. Jake's smile was now so predatory that several students instinctively leaned away from him. We're the only species that figured out how to make other pack hunters work for us. You already mentioned that, Gloop managed to say, though his color suggested he was regretting speaking up. No, Jake said, shaking his head. I don't think you understand what I mean. Let me be more specific. He stood up again and walked to the holographic display, gesturing to images of various Earth creatures. Humans didn't just domesticate wolves. We selectively bred them for thousands of generations to enhance specific traits. We created dozens of subspecies optimized for different types of hunting, fighting, and working. We made some of them better at tracking, others better at fighting, others better at herding prey animals that we also domesticated. The hologram showed the incredible variety of dog breeds, from massive mastiffs to tiny terriers, each designed for specific purposes. We took horses and bred them for warfare, for racing, for hauling massive loads across impossible terrain. We created breeds that could carry armored knights into battle or pull artillery across mountain ranges. Images of various horse breeds flashed across the display. We domesticated cattle, pigs, chickens, goats, sheep. We didn't just make them easier to manage, we made them dependent on us for survival. We created animals that literally cannot survive without human intervention. But Zephyr's chiming was barely audible. That's genetic manipulation on a species-wide scale. Over thousands of generations, Jake agreed cheerfully, and we did it without any technology more advanced than selective breeding and basic agriculture. We reshaped entire ecosystems to support our food production. We turned apex predators into hunting partners and prey animals into willing participants in their own consumption. Professor Claxon was now trembling visibly. Mr. Morrison, what you're describing isn't domestication. It's ecosystem-wide domination through genetic manipulation and psychological conditioning. Sure, Jake shrugged. But here's the really impressive part. We didn't stop there. There's more? Spike's voice was barely a whisper. Jake's grin widened. We convinced our prey to help us hunt other prey. The classroom was so quiet that Jake could hear the sound of his own heartbeat. Every alien in the room was staring at him with the kind of horror usually reserved for natural disasters or cosmic phenomena. Cattle herding, Jake explained, as if he were discussing the weather. We trained horses to help us manage cattle. We bred dogs to help us control sheep. We created entire agricultural systems where our food animals are managed by other animals that we've convinced to work for us instead of eating us. But Gloop's color had shifted to something that suggested his species had no word for the emotion he was currently experiencing. Completely unprecedented in galactic history, Jake suggested. Yeah, we get that a lot. He walked back to his seat but remained standing, clearly enjoying the effect he was having. See, most species either compete or cooperate. Humans figured out how to do both simultaneously. We compete with other predators by making them cooperate with us. We compete with prey species by making them cooperate with our hunting of other prey species. We've essentially turned cooperation itself into a form of predation. Professor Claxon's voice came out as barely more than a whisper. What? What are you studying here at Galactic University, Mr. Morrison? Jake's smile became positively radiant. Interspecies diplomacy. The sound that came from Professor Claxon was not quite a scream, but it wasn't entirely unlike one either. It was the sound of someone having a realization so terrible that their brain was trying to reject it for the sake of their own sanity. With a minor in psychological warfare, Jake added helpfully. Zephyr made a sound like breaking glass. Gloop had turned a color that didn't exist in nature and was making small, distressed bubbling noises. Spike's mandibles were clicking so rapidly, they sounded like a machine gun. You see, Jake continued, apparently oblivious to the growing hysteria around him. After we finished domesticating our own planet, we figured we should probably learn how to make friends with everybody else in the galaxy. Wouldn't want there to be any misunderstandings about our intentions. Professor Klaxon stood up abruptly, his chair making a sharp scraping sound that caused everyone to jump. Class dismissed, he announced, his voice cracking. Early dismissal, everyone out, now. The alien students didn't need to be told twice. There was a stampede toward the exits that would have been impressive if it hadn't been so terrifying. Zephyr's chiming reached panic frequencies as she vibrated out of the room. Gloop flowed toward the door with a speed that defied several laws of physics. Spike's 6 legs carried him to the exit so fast he was basically a blur. Within 30 seconds, the classroom was empty except for Jake and Professor Klaxon. Klaxon stood there for a long moment, all 4 arms hanging limply at his sides, staring at the human with the expression of someone who had just realized that everything he thought he knew about the universe was not just wrong, but wrong in ways that were going to give him nightmares for the rest of his life. Finally, he spoke. Mr. Murison? Yes, Professor. Please tell me you're joking. Jake considered this for a moment, then shook his head. Sorry, Professor, but look on the bright side. There's a bright side to this. Klaxon's voice was hollow. Jake's smile was warm and friendly, and absolutely terrifying. Well, now you know why the galaxy needs diplomats. He gathered up his tablet and stylus, slung his worn leather bag over his shoulder, and headed for the door. Just before he reached it, he turned back. Oh, and Professor, you might want to update your textbook. The section on Earth predators is really quite out of date. And with that, Jake Morrison walked out of the classroom, leaving Professor Klaxon alone with the horrifying realization that somewhere in the galaxy, there was an entire planet full of creatures like that human, and they were all really, really interested in making friends. The sound of Klaxon's nervous breakdown echoed through the empty halls of the xenobiology department for the better part of an hour. In the distance, the peaceful sound of Jake Morrison humming while he walked to his next class gradually faded away, leaving only the eternal silence of space, and the gentle hum of a space station populated by beings who were slowly beginning to understand just how badly they had misjudged the friendly little species from the 3rd planet of an unremarkable yellow star. And somewhere in the administrative offices of Galactic University, a memo was being drafted recommending significant increases to the budget for the interspecies diplomacy program. Just to be safe.